to the Tangier American Legation. I am Jen Rasami Manana, and I am the director, and I am so pleased to see you all here, and I'm so pleased to have our friend Alasdair Soussi with us. I have been here for about 1.5 years, and in my first month here, I got an email from a very polite gentleman who very nicely said, "Hey, I'm writing a book about James McBey." And I thought, oh, I wonder who James McBey is. Just kidding. I did know who he was. I did know that we had some of his things here, but I didn't know who he was. And I think Ali wanted a picture, the second one here, that he subsequently put in his book. You will see it in the book. And in getting the picture ready for him and all that, I started to learn about him. I thought, this is going to be an amazing book. And then I thought, well, you know, books take a long time. Maybe I'll never see it. But what a great project. I'm glad someone's working on it. And then one day he said, okay, the book's ready. It's all done. Can I come talk about it? I thought, wow, that's awesome. That's wonderful. So we had to postpone once. And that was very sad because it was something I'd really been looking forward to. And I think I had talked to many of you about it and you were planning to come. So it makes tonight even more special to be gathering with Ali and to hear more about James McBey, about this incredible book that he's written. This is the first biography of James McBey, and I think it is an important step in bringing this incredible man with this wonderful artistic legacy and truly an amazing life to people who may not have known about him. So gathered here in this room are people who have connections to the McBeys in many different ways. So I'm delighted to have you, but I'm also delighted to have the people who might be following us today and then subsequently who might watch this who'll have a chance to discover this fascinating figure. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to our friend Alasdair Soussi, journalist, writer, lover of James McBey.
No, just lover.
Or lover. Incredible raconteur. And I'll tell you, he could be talking about anything, and I would sit back and listen to the incredible Scottish burr with great pleasure. But in this case, he's going to be talking about some very interesting things. Ali, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. What a delight it is to be here to talk about the great Scottish artist adventurer James McBey. The Tangier is, of course, the city where McBey ended his days. McBey owned 2 properties here, lived with his wife here, and when he died in December 1959, he was buried here. Now, the reason I find myself in this privileged position talking about James McBey is because of my biography, Shadows and Light, the extraordinary life of James McBey, and the recently ended Aberdeen Art Gallery exhibition in Scotland of the same name. Now, my biography was published in December 2022 by Edinburgh Scotland Street Press, and as Jen said, it's the world's first biography of James McBey. Now, I'm a journalist by trade, and it was journalistically that I approached this biography, looking at the man behind the art, but in a manner in which the art is crucial to the man. Now, McBey was without doubt one of the most talented artists of the 20th century. A world-renowned painter in watercolours and oils, he was seen first and foremost, however, as a genius etcher and as the printmaking heir to Rembrandt and Whistler. Now, he died many miles away from his Scottish northeast birthplace, where he had been born nearly 76 years earlier. But he did so willingly, having first fallen in love with Morocco as a 28-year-old. And I will show you how the Arabic-speaking world as a whole was very much part of his DNA, both personally and artistically. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you McBey, the Middle East, and Morocco. Okay, that's worked. So let's dive right in now by listening to a 75-year-old James McBey in his own words, speaking from his Tangier home of El Fulk. And if you've never heard his voice before, you're in for a real treat. So I'll play you 2 sets of audio just to begin. And just for your information, The first voice you will hear in each set is that of a man called Leo Comstead. And Leo Comstead was a Swede who was living in Tangier, and he was the one who brought the recording equipment into Elfolk. Now, James McBey was quite shy, and he had to be coaxed out of his shyness. You'll also hear in the second clip that I play his masseuse, come nurse, called Molly Huskell. And Molly Huskell was the lady who looked after James when Marguerite was away. So let's play the audio.
Well, we are now at Mr. McBey's place, and I want to take a trip around the house to see what he has got here. I know he has some fine paintings over there. Do you want to follow me?
Oh, yes, I'll be glad to accompany you, but I don't know what to say about the paintings.
Can't we go in and have a look?
Yes.
This is a wonderful thing. What is that really?
Well, these are etchings by Holler. He was an artist who was sent down to Tangier about 1667 by Charles II to make drawings and show Charles what sort of a place Tangier was. He made about 24 drawings, and he brought them back to England.
But why? Why was England interested of Tangier?
Because England got to Tangier as Charles II's dowry.
Oh, is that so? I didn't
When he
know
married
that.
Catherine of Braganza.
That's very interesting, yes.
So this next clip features Molly Huskell, so she's in the conversation.
Well, now we are sitting in the parlor having some coffee. So I suppose we can go on talking here. It's a lovely acoustic here. It's a lovely sound.
Much better than the dining room, isn't it?
Oh, yes, it is. I've been looking at that, what you have in that cup. The dark thing. It looks like hashish, isn't it?
Hashish, yes.
No.
Given that makes you wild.
That is sugar.
That makes you
sugar.
That makes you wild, eating that green stuff. you
Oh,
know.
he's wild enough.
I wonder one thing, Molly. You have been here a few days now.
Yes, I have been here since Friday last.
To me, it's rather curious because Mr. McBey is a married man.
Yes, because
And
you
you're a
for
lovely
that.
girl coming over here with him nighttime. What's that for?
But I am here daytime too. You see, I will explain you that case. Because
Yeah?
I am very good friend with them both.
Oh.
And Mrs. McBey has gone to Paris. And she asked me to stay here and take care of her husband because she doesn't want to let him alone.
Oh, that's
And
nice.
when Mr. McBey can speak Spanish and talk with the servants, and if somebody comes and be alone in that big house, that is not so.
And what do you say, Mr. McBey? Has he been taking care of you all right?
Oh, yes, she's been taking care of me all right. She's given me one massage, is it?
I thought you were massaging all the day long.
Oh, no. She is, but I'm not.
Now, it's poignant because this was recorded just 2 months before he died. But you can hear that in the first clip, he had great intellect. He actually left school at 14, but he had great intellect, talking about Charles II and the etchings by Holler. And also in the second clip, you can see he had a great sense of fun too. And also, something that I quite like is that he retained his Scottish accent. It was maybe dulled through time because he was an international traveller, he had left Scotland a long time ago, but he never lost his accent. A lot of Scots who took the road to London and then the world to make it big, they, especially back in the day, they either, deliberately lost their accent or their accent faded completely, but not James McBey. I always think of that first meeting between Samuel Johnson, the man widely believed to have composed the first modern English dictionary, and his future biographer, James Boswell, in the 18th century, when the Scotsman Boswell apologises to the Englishman Johnson for being Scottish, saying, "I do indeed come from Scotland, but I cannot help it." But that was not James McBey's ethos. He lived and worked across Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and the United States. But as his wife Marguerite would say many years after her husband had died, he had thistles on his tongue. But we can also hear from both sets of audio that James McBey was a settled figure in Tangier. He was 75 years old, and Tangier was his home. So by the time James McBey was uttering these words in 1959, he had made some of the finest works of art of the 20th century, such as these wonderful oil on canvas works here, which are held at Aberdeen Art Gallery in Scotland's northeast. And the gallery here is pictured bottom left. So the top left, for instance, we have James McBey's vibrant Acrobats, Marrakesh from 1936. In the bottom middle, we have James McBey's delicious portrait of his wife, Marguerite, looking very cool in Tangier from 1950. Now, theirs had been quite a volatile marriage, but by the time this was painted in the 50s, life was much more tranquil for the couple. And then the top right, we have the portrait of Vesey Owens. Now, this is Aberdeen Art Gallery's newest acquisition. Vesey is the 8-year-old, or was the 8-year-old African-American girl who James McBey captured on canvas in North Carolina in America in 1940. Now this, we have to remember, was pre-civil rights America. It was full of ugly, racist imagery. But James McBey captured Vesey affectionately and authentically. And of course, he also painted the likes of these. Now, you don't need to look at that. You need to look at this, because here it is in the flesh, of course, behind me. And of course, these are lovingly cared for here at the Tangier American Legation. So we have James McBey's portrait of Clemence Bonnet-Matthews, captured like a movie star, and there'll be more on her later. And then we have James McBey's hypnotic Zohra here, from 1952, the oil on canvas of his domestic servant. And this is, as I understand it, known as the Moroccan Mona Lisa, or the Zohra Lisa, because her eyes follow you around the room. And I know this because my 5-year-old daughter, who I brought last year, she ran backwards and forwards in front of it, and she reliably told me that her Zohra's eyes did indeed follow you around the room. And I would never argue with her. And this is what the United States thought of him artistically during the 1940s. Here in the 1945 Boston Daily Globe writes about Boston Public Library's collection of James McBey etchings. Only Francisco Goya has rivaled these etchings, the Boston Daily Globe, 1945. And these are the sort of ones here that the Boston Daily Globe were talking about. The top left, you have Santa Maria della Fava from Venice in Italy in 1926. And in the top middle, you have the first sight of New York, dated 1929. And that was when he was coming into port on the Majestic, just 2 or 3 days before the Wall Street crash. This was typical of McBey. He was always in places where stuff was happening. And he did a very quick sketch on the deck of the Majestic, which he turned into this wonderful print. And in the bottom middle, you have his 1917 masterpiece that would sell like hotcakes in the 1920s. Dawn, the Camel Patrol setting out. His scene of the Australian Camel Patrol in the Egypt Sinai Desert during World War I. And of course, he was Britain's official war artist on the Palestine front during World War I. And in the top right, one of my favourites, Ovation to the Matador from 1911 Spain. And indeed, Ovation to the Matador is actually, along with some other of James McBey's works, actually going on sale at an Edinburgh auction house, Lion and Turnbull, in a few days' time. And to give you a sort of idea of what James McBey goes for nowadays, Ovation is a single impression. And bear in mind, he would produce 30, 40, 50, 60 signed impressions of each work. Is going for an estimate, they think, because it's an auction, of about £1,000 to £2,000, which is about $1,200 to $2,500 for a single impression. Separately from this, and to give you an idea of James McBey's major oil works, a major oil on canvas work was privately sold actually very recently for a 6-figure sum. So he has a price. But certainly his etching masterpieces, of course, also included those from Morocco. And we will get to those in a wee minute. But where did it all begin? Well, it began here in Scotland's northeast. So James McBey was born in 1883 illegitimately in the northeast of Scotland, in a small place called Fovrin in Aberdeenshire. The red marker tag there you can see is the wee, I suppose, parish where he was born, right on the North Sea. Now, illegitimacy and sex outside marriage was condemned by the church across Scotland, of course, but in James McBey's native Aberdeenshire, it was somewhat more tolerated because of the needs of the region's farming communities. That said, though, illegitimacy was still something of a stain in late Victorian Scotland and late Victorian Britain. And James McBey's parental origins, you can see, appeared on his birth certificate. So he carried this feeling of not being wanted, like his life was a mistake. Now, James McBey Sr., the father, recognised his son. He was a farmer, as you can see by the signature. So we can see the top left slide, the map of Scotland with the northeast. And then on the right, the slide, the cottage in which James McBey was born in 1883, which adjoined the blacksmiths. His mother's family were blacksmiths. And then, of course, the birth certificate. And then you can read on the extreme left, James McBey, and then it says underneath it, illegitimate. He carried that with him all his life. Here we have James McBey as the childhood artist. Now these two early works are actually mentioned in the early life of James McBey, which goes from 1883 to 1911. Now it's a small masterpiece, it's a very short book, and when I was doing my biography, as far as literary works were concerned, that was the only literary work. But it's a wonderful book, and he talks about painting these two portraits, the umbrella mender on the left, and the musician on the right. And he was able to do these two works as a young teenager. I believe he was about 13 years old when he did this, when he was just living in Aberdeenshire with his mother and his grandmother. And he copied these from a periodical or a journal. Now, I'd never seen these before when I was researching my book. They've actually just recently been added to the archives and catalogued, so it's a real pleasure to be able to show you these two works today. But it was Aberdeen, in the city, pictured here in the red outline, just 13 miles away from his rural home, where he lived from 1899 as a bank clerk. He hated being a bank clerk. He thought being a bank clerk was really boring, but his mother and grandmother made him they made him leave school at 14. He became a bank clerk, and that's what he worked as. But he always wanted to be an artist. But he lived here in the city of Aberdeen, at 42 Union Grove, Aberdeen, Scotland. And you can see that he lived here with his mother, Annie Gillespie, at the bottom right, and his grandmother, Mary, at the bottom middle, who James McBey actually painted in 1901. He painted a portrait of his grandmother in 1901, the day of Queen Victoria's funeral, because he had the day off. And he used that day off to paint his grandmother, and that portrait is hanging at Aberdeen Art Gallery. Now, in his writings, James McBey laments the relationship with his mother, but he speaks affectionately of his grandmother, who would outlive several monarchs, her own husband, and even some of her own children, including Annie herself, James McBey's mother. So you can see the plaque on the top left. That plaque is outside 42 Union Grove. It says James McBey, the artist, lived here. And then on the right, a very cool-looking James McBey as a 21-year-old, looking very confident. And then the bottom middle, the grandmother. And then the right, the bottom right, as I said, the very forlorn picture of his mother. Indeed, central to the pain of James McBey's childhood was Annie, his mother. As I mentioned earlier, there was his illegitimacy. But not just that, mother-son relations appeared to be strained and unhappy. But I think we have to be fair to Annie herself. Despite James McBey's own writings, in which he says that there was little demonstrations of motherly affection. For example, the top left there, we have the 1885 church session minutes that reveal that Annie was essentially shamed, together with James McBey Sr., by the Church of Scotland. You can see I pulled a quote. Annie Gillespie and James McBey Sr. pled guilty to the sin of fornication with each other. Foveran Church Session Minutes from 1885. Now, James McBey was born in 1883. And I thought if his parents were punished by the church, it would be 1884, but it wasn't. It wasn't until 1885. The reason being is I don't think they wanted to be punished by the church, but they had to get James McBey baptized. The only way that they could get James McBey baptized was to go through the machinery of being punished by the church. And certainly what happened later in 1885, James McBey, he was baptized. Also too, Annie didn't marry the man with whom she conceived, James McBey. So you can only imagine or take that as an indication that in a sense she was effectively abandoned, because we're talking here the late Victorian period in Scotland. But it's interesting to say that actually James McBey Sr., James McBey's father, he would remain a bachelor all his life. He would never marry. And he would actually die in England in the 1920s. Annie also suffered from poor mental health, which was worsened by her losing her sight. You can see the top middle is a prescription that I discovered in the archives from the late 19th century, and it's for atropine sulfate, which didn't work. She had iritis, which you can cure today easily, but back then they gave her leeches. James McBey would have to put the leeches, and of course that did nothing. It was a completely useless form of medication. But you can see the bottom two works. James McBey painted these, I think, about 1901 of his mother. The one on the left, the side profile of his mother, because she was concerned that there was something wrong with her eyes, that her eyes looked funny or looked weird. So James McBey painted her side on. But then you have the which for me is the more confronting pencil sketch he does of his mother, looking straight out of the picture space. But why is it confronting? It's confronting because she was blind. And yet she's staring right at you. And that's how he's presented her. Let me read you a short passage, because we know that Annie eventually takes her own life in 1906 in the basement of her home at 42 Union Grove. She tragically hangs herself, and James McBey finds her body and cuts her body down. Let me read you a short passage in which I tried to imagine Annie's state of mind, and also, I suppose, the scene which James McBey would be confronted with. As Christmas 1906 approached, a fancy goods store on Union Street was advertising its gift range on the front page of the Aberdeen Daily Journal, and the cold and wintry city was looking forward to the festive season. But alienated from the festivities, sometime during Tuesday 11 December, Annie decided to satisfy an urge she had doubtlessly considered for years. She had lightly rehearsed it repeatedly in her mind as she lay in bed at night, or sat up in the parlour until the early hours, close to her old prescriptions for atropine sulfate and other ineffective medications. When McBey returned home from his studio at 9:30 p.m, all was quiet. His grandmother was already tucked up against the winter chill, but Annie was probably lying alert, rigid and still, and must have heard her 22-year-old son ready himself for sleep. When nothing stirred, she slipped out of bed and felt her way by touch as her sightless eyes, now ravaged by repeated bouts of iritis, resulting almost certainly in some or all of secondary optic nerve damage, cataracts and glaucoma, gaped like two black holes from a face of frown lines and sorrow. She opened the tenement door to the landing and delicately made her way down the stone stairs and into the basement. If she had practiced her route in times past, she would have known where to find the rope, which part of the ceiling she could most easily reach and how many steps to take. Tying one end of the cord around the rafter and the other around her pale neck, she drew her weary body upwards and pulled the noose tight. We will never know if she hesitated before she let herself drop, but her resolve to end her torment was surely not without struggle, as she lightly wriggled and twitched like a fish on a line until death overcame her. She was 45 and had finally taken control of her life by choosing how and when to end it. But now, hanging lifelessly in the cold, she was alone in the dark once more. I know that that's a bit confronting, but we have to remember that that was what James McBey was confronted with in just several weeks before Christmas Day in 1906. Let me play you a short film with some narration from my book as James McBey heads south from Scotland to begin a new life in London in 1911 as a full-time artist. And here I speculate about the thoughts that he made on that train journey. So it's important to note that James McBey's past, the wounds of his past, his illegitimacy, his relationship with his mother and her suicide, would haunt him for the rest of his days, even here in Morocco. A friend of James McBey's would later recall how he worried that people in Tangiers' expat community would find out that he was illegitimate. As the saying goes, wherever you go, there you are. So let me play you McBey on the London-bound train from Scotland, May 29, 1911.
What was on McBey's mind as his train hurtled southwards across the Victorian-built tracks on the 29th of May 1911? He would have had plenty of time to contemplate as he sat back for the 8 or so hours it would have taken him to reach the British capital from Scotland's central belt. Might his dead mother have consumed his waking thoughts, or if he had managed some sleep, his dreams? Habitually reflective, as his 50 years of diary keeping testify, it seems likely that he was looking back on the past. A couple of years before Annie took her own life, McBey had been offered the chance to swap his job at the bank for work at a tea plantation in Ceylon. McBey had told his mother of this unexpected opportunity, which would have seen him earn £300 per year as opposed to the paltry 55 he was making as an overworked bank clerk. Annie, McBey credibly claimed, did not meet the news positively, so clearly frightened was she about being left behind, and he himself was naturally torn about the move. According to McBey's autobiography, it was an old coin that he had earlier found at Fovran Kirkyard which decided his fate. In a story which sounds suspiciously apocryphal in nature, he flipped the coin 7 times, 5 falling with the thistle side, his choice for remaining in Scotland facing up. Reading between the lines, the offer had come just too soon, and not ready to throw in his lot with some faraway job opportunity, he was relieved to come to a decision by subterfuge. Could it have been this episode that he replayed in his mind as he made for England? Or was he recalling the rose and kiss he received from a Jeanie Gordon in July 1904 at Inch, Aberdeenshire, where he had spent a short time clerking at the village branch of his bank? Or was he instead fretting about his eyes, fearing that what had happened to Annie might happen to him? As a boy, McBey had discovered that he had trouble reading the clock on Newborough's Holyrood Chapel from afar. He had tried on Annie's eyeglasses, much to her fury, and discovered that he was in fact short-sighted. In adulthood, and while working at the bank, he took to wearing spectacles and was terrified that he had inherited some incurable defect.
Okay, let's get on to Morocco. And James McBey's relationship with Morocco began in 1912, and we can credit this man, James Kerr Lawson, with introducing them both. Now, James Kerr Lawson was a Scots-Canadian artist who had emigrated from Scotland with his family while he was young to Ontario. They met each other in London at the Chelsea Arts Club, and he took McBey under his wing, and he became like a father figure to McBey. Now, James Kerr Lawson's education stretched to Rome and Paris. James McBey was largely self-taught. James Kerr Lawson's mother was a writer. She actually made a bit of a name for herself in both Canada and Scotland. Now, this would be James McBey's first visit to this country, but it wouldn't be James Kerr Lawson. James Kerr Lawson had been here many times before. Now, I've called this the first kiss because James McBey's first visit to Morocco would inspire a lifelong love affair. And here we have just two of the many etchings from this visit that you probably know, the storyteller on the left and the beggar on the right. There is for me a kind of haunting quality about these, especially the beggar, which has a sort of ominous air to it, I think. But the detail on both of these are quite astonishing. And remember, he was a largely self-taught artist, but as an etcher, he was entirely self-taught. Let me read you just a quick passage again from my book. It just gives you an idea of 1912 Morocco from his perspective, from Tetuan. He was in Tetuan in 1912, and then he came to this city, Tangier, in 1913. Working as an artist on the mean streets of Tetuan proved a steep learning curve. He witnessed, quote, a fine-looking Arab taken to be tried for murder with a rope around his neck and the ends held by two guards. McBey longed to sketch the cemetery which lay outside the walls of the Medina, and though he anticipated trouble, he went ahead. He was fully cognizant of conservative Islam's aversion to pictures and images, and often worked covertly when he required human subjects. No sooner had he settled to begin sketching the cemetery than he was surrounded by an armed group of, quote, fierce-looking locals. Their antique flintlock firearms were cocked, and McBey watched as they, quote, became restless, shifting their guns from hand to hand and craning their necks to see what I was doing. Then with alarming suddenness they began to talk. Not a sentence was intelligible, but their demeanour spelled trouble. Their voices grew louder and harsher, their gesticulations more threatening. Now, was he kind of trying to make a little bit of colour? Because this actually came from a newspaper report in Aberdeen, so he was probably jazzing it up a wee bit. But what you can certainly say is that these sights and experiences were exotic, and especially for a man who had come from Scotland's northeast and the North Sea coast. So here we have McBey a few years later in London, 1915. So by this point, he was actually a world traveller. We have to make it clear that this was a time when people didn't travel. People barely left their village, and if they left their village, they barely left their county. If they left their county, they barely left, their country. By 1907, he'd been to France. And he'd been to France, actually, while he was still a bank clerk in Aberdeen. He'd been sent on an assignment to the Bank of England by his bank, and he decided to use that to hop across the channel for just a wee visit to France. He'd been to the Netherlands in 1910. And that was the day that he left his job as a bank clerk. He decided to jack it in, and then the same day he travelled to the Netherlands as a full-time artist. And why the Netherlands? Because that was the birthplace of his hero, Rembrandt. And then he went to Spain in 1911, and that was his first foreign trip as a London resident. And then, of course, he came here in 1912, 1913. We should say a word too. He was a very handsome man. You can see he had the brooding artistic appearance, the strong jawline, and the swept back hair. He would be, as you may know, very, very popular with the opposite sex. But if he was in Morocco in 1912, 1913, he wouldn't have to wait too long before he was back in the Arabic-speaking world again. And here we have a wartime map of the Middle East. And this is where James McBey would spend the summer of 1917 to February 1919 as Britain's official war artist on the Palestine front during World War I. Think the 1962 David Lean film, I can't get that out of my head, of Lawrence of Arabia, because this was James McBey's canvas for give or take about 20 months. And make no mistake, James McBey knew the religious significance of these lands which now shook under the weight of the Allies and the Ottomans as they fought for control in the Middle East. He had been raised within the Protestant Church of Scotland Church, and he was aware of the Holy Land and just what it meant. But how did he get this gig? I mean, what a gig to get, the Palestine Front. Well, by 1917 he had some fame. He was seen as the bright new shiny thing in the London art scene. So he had some fame behind him. He'd also, as I suggested earlier on, he was a member of the Chelsea Arts Club. Now this is a slight anomaly in a sense because he wasn't a big joiner of things. But he probably knew that when he arrived in London, he had to grease the wheels a little bit. So he joined the Chelsea Arts Club where he rubbed shoulders probably with the right people. But of course, it was his Moroccan experience which was very handy in giving him the opportunity to become the war artist on the Palestine front. He'd only been to Morocco for a few months, but we're talking the early 20th century, and that was probably enough experience to be able to send him to a place that was as war-torn as that. So here we have him, James McBey, the war artist. This is a man that would witness the fall of Jerusalem in 1917, in December 1917. This is a man who would witness the fall of Damascus about a year later, in October 1918. And I've said here he's rocking the look because I love this photo. I think this is, if you're going to be a war artist in the Middle East, this is a pretty cool photo. You've got the buzz cut, you've got the pith helmet on the desert floor, you can see just on the left. You've got the tightly bound laces, and you've got the concentration. He was 33 years old at this time. He was at the peak of his powers. And his first marquee assignment when he arrived on the Palestine front, so he arrived at Alexandria. He then moved from Alexandria to Cairo. And actually, I should say that in his diary, one of his first observations when he gets to Cairo is strange to smell those Moorish smells again. So he's thinking about Morocco subliminally, but he's thinking about it. It's there. He can't get Morocco maybe out of his mind. So this is his first marquee assignment with the Camel Corps, and specifically with the Australian Camel Patrol. Now, James McBey's colleagues, as far as war artists were concerned, they were on the Western Front. They had the mud and the trenches and the slime and the rats and the rain. James McBey had the camels and the sand and the dust and the desert and the mosquitoes. It's a completely different arena for McBey. And he would follow these guys around for 5 days on reconnaissance, ending up in Egypt's Sinai Desert, where he would, in his diary, and he talks a lot about this, he would bathe in the Suez Canal. Which, of course, this assignment would lead to what we discussed there just very briefly a few slides ago. Dawn, the Camel Patrol setting out, his magnus opus, his masterpiece etching. In actual fact, McBey, he was interviewed in the 1940s. He couldn't see what the fuss was about, why people loved this so much. But I've said here, space, no clutter, because there's 9 camel riders, and I know because I counted them. But he's not felt the need to clutter his composition. He's not put 99 camel riders, or he's not put the 9 camel riders as the focal point. Essentially, there's nothing there but space. And what he's trying to tell you, I think, is this is my arena. This is where I am working. It goes on and on and on. It doesn't end. It's flat. And this particular work would break records. In 1926 in New York City, this would fetch at auction more or less what we would consider to be now a single impression. And bear in mind, he would produce 30, 40, 50, and he would sign each one of them. But just a single impression, what is today probably about $30,000 for a single impression. He was a superstar of the etching world. Bear in mind, of course, that this was close to the Wall Street crash, 1926. The Wall Street crash would have an adverse effect on etchings. McBey would turn his attentions to oils and watercolours. But nevertheless, he talks actually in the 20s about people seeing him as a messiah figure. But he obviously dealt with it very well. So what was he doing in the Middle East? He was capturing history. History was changing before his eyes. Now, he had nothing to do with the political side of things, but he was a witness to how the Middle East was changing during World War I. And let me again just play you a short film with some narration from the book to give you an idea of another iconic assignment. James McBey and the Allied entry into Jerusalem, December of 1917.
Nearly every nationality and every mode of transport walking up the road to Jerusalem, McBey observed on the 6th of December, and in the days following, neither rain nor bad roads could stop his progress. Jerusalem was in the hands of a Christian-led army for the first time since the Crusades, newly seized from the clutches of the Ottoman Turks, who had abandoned this religious and historical epicentre in the cool December air without a fight. The Allies, including Allenby and T.E. Lawrence, ceremoniously entered the city on the 11th on foot, and McBey was there to see and sketch the procession, remarking in his diary that there was great excitement. Crowds began to form outside Jaffa Gate. He had chosen the balcony of the Grand New Hotel, then converted into a hospital of 250 beds, to watch Allenby, walking tall and straight, lead a line of Allied officers and military attaches through the old city at noon. Excited spectators lined the streets, peered from windows and gathered on balconies in the glare of the winter sun. We saw the procession, the proclamations and the Sheikh's presentation, which I thought most picturesque, McBey observed. Bertha, Spafford, Vester, a leading light of Jerusalem's American colony, recalled being ushered away from the front of the balcony to make way for the burly Scotsman. Of course I minded, she recalled in her 1950 book, Our Jerusalem, after being forced to witness history over McBey's shoulder. But I could not refuse the official artist a good place to make the sketches for his famous painting of the historical entry of General Allenby. His subsequent oil-on-canvas work, The Allies Entering Jerusalem, 11th December 1917, with its use of space and falling shadows, did indeed become famous, even if its artists thought the Allied handling of the surrender of the city itself absolutely lacking in spectacular effect. Not without reason are we believed to be the most unimaginative of the civilized races, McBey opined. Yet the seizure of Jerusalem provoked much jubilation back home, as one reader of the Manchester Guardian attested. Evoking General Allenby as the master of the holy places, J.E.C. Weldon of the Deanery, writing in the newspaper's letter to the editor column, described the city's capture as one of those dramatic events which touched the imagination of the world.
Now we have to remember the very colonialist and imperialist nature and tone of how things were looked at from Britain, especially this triumphant newspaper report here. I think it's always important to contextualize things, especially, of course, I'm speaking from the Arabic-speaking world, and as somebody too who's half Arab myself. Now, you might well know that another iconic assignment was him meeting T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, in Damascus in October 1918. This was just the day before Lawrence would leave the Palestine front completely and return home to England. I've said here it's a portrait for the ages. And this is a man who's considered almost like a secular saint in Britain. But again, we have to remember that if he is actually, and I'm talking about T.E. Lawrence, known at all in this region, he's not quite seen in the same fashion, of course, in the Arabic-speaking world. Obviously, because of Britain's treatment of the Middle East after World War I, which was less than honourable. But let me just read you another passage of McBey. You can see on the left there, I should say, the study sketch that McBey did, and then the right is the finished portrait, which is actually hanging at the Imperial War Museum in London. 5'5" Lawrence, pensive and exhausted, presented himself to McBey on the forenoon of 3rd October at the Victoria Hotel. McBey, broader and 6 inches taller, was tasked with the duty of painting the victorious intelligence officer turned guerrilla fighter. The artist, on the face of it, had little in common with a man who had spent 2 years blowing up bridges in Turkish trains. Yet they met as outsiders, both born illegitimately in late 19th century Britain. McBey, the largely self-taught etcher and painter, and Lawrence, the enigmatic Arabist. McBey would recall the moving occasion when he sketched the motionless Lawrence, who dressed head to toe in native robes of white and gold, greeted a steady stream of Arabs as they bowed before him and kissed his right hand in tearful goodbyes. McBey's finished portrait remains an artistic triumph more than a century on. It is a composition which was later described by a clearly confronted Lawrence as, quote, shockingly strange to me. His face is as thin and sharp as a dagger, and his eyes enormous and profoundly sad in the sapping autumn heat of Damascus, where confusion, chaos, jealousies and violence reign supreme. It is the face of a man worn out by danger, stress, responsibility and disappointment. Why disappointment? Because he knew that Britain was going to renege on its promise, on its promise to give the Arabs a state with Damascus as its capital. He knew that, and he carried that with him, and I think you can see it in his face, perhaps. But I should say that he wasn't just making art, but love. And here we have Isa Curtis on the left. Isa was the married British woman with whom James McBey would have a passionate affair on the Palestine front in over 1917 and 1918. They actually met in Egypt. Her husband was working in Upper Egypt as an engineer. This was the great love affair of James McBey's life. You can see on the left is the photograph of Isa, and then on the right, the portrait of Isa, which I discovered wonderfully is hanging here in Tangier. But I wasn't content just to take James McBey's word for it regarding his love affairs. And like a lot of the women in his life, I dug a bit deeper, so I discovered that she was actually Isabel or Isabella Hempseed, which is a really unusual name, and that she'd actually been born to an army family in modern-day Myanmar, and that she carried James McBey's child, and sadly the child died just after a few days. And in Aberdeen Art Gallery, you can read her letters, which had to be written in a kind of a code because they couldn't tell each other that they were having an affair and that she was, pregnant with his child. But this is James McBey on the left at the end of the war. In January 1919, at the end of his World War I commission, he would just have one more month. You can see on the left, he's skinny, he's bony, he's suntanned, but he's got a kind of triumphant look on his face. I mean, this is a man who's kind of climbed Everest and survived, and he's rode the Atlantic and survived, but most importantly, he's lived to tell the tale. Then you can see the juxtaposition in the middle. James McBey, 5 years later at the Chelsea Arts Club in 1924. The man about town. James McBey is at the right of that picture in the middle, standing. Now, he'd obviously put on a lot of the weight that he had lost on the Palestine front. But the 1920s were the decadent era for McBey of art and love affairs. It was the roaring 20s. And James McBey did a lot of roaring, I can tell you. Indeed, the middle image has standing centre Anne Finlay, who's a Scottish artist, who had been painted by another Scottish artist who was called Dorothy Johnson in 1920, and that portrait is on the right. That was quite a risque portrait for 1920. And James McBey and Anne Finlay, they were romantically involved with each other during the mid-1920s. But it wasn't Anne Finlay or Frances Gripper, another one of his girlfriends who was from America, from California, or Faye Woods. I could go on. But it was Marguerite Loeb, who would become James McBey's wife. And of course, I don't need to tell you that. And we know what a legend Marguerite, of course, would become here in Tangier. Of course, we know Marguerite was a bookbinder from Philadelphia. You can see on the left the photograph of her and how stunning she was. But she was stunning, but she was also accomplished. She'd have been educated in Europe, as you probably know, and she had had an affair with the Austrian artist Oskar Kokoschka. James McBey met Marguerite in Philadelphia in December 1930. And then they went to Bermuda together for a holiday in February 1931. And you can see on the right-hand side the sketch that he made of Marguerite in February 1931. He moved fast. And then they would marry in March 1931 in New York City in Manhattan. And on the same day, they would board an ocean liner for England. And it was with Marguerite, of course, that James McBey would revisit Morocco in 1932, where he had, of course, been some 2 decades, or about 20 years earlier. They would, of course, in 1936, purchase Dar Benzina in Marrakesh, but it was Jalabi. You can see the Marrakesh property below, but it was Jalabi, pictured here in a watercolour above by James McBey, that the couple bought their first Moroccan property in Tangier in 1933. Let me just give you a very quick reading here of James McBey and Marguerite before they bought the property. They were eyeing it up and wanting to buy it. Marguerite was lithe, graceful and elegant, and her 49-year-old husband was imposing and outwardly unflappable. With the artist lightly leading the way, they traversed groves of giant cedars and large, twisted acacias, emitting the sweet scent of their yellow blossoms. Deeper into the undergrowth they ventured, leaving an excited medley of Scottish and American voices in their wake until the ocean was in sight, and soon the whole coast of northern Africa to its most northwesterly point lay before them. McBey loved it immediately and decided to make it his own, buying the house and garden and later the adjacent land of 30 acres. The house they called Jalabi, a playful and Arabic-sounding corruption of James and Loeb, and the land Sharifian Rocks, after the Sharif who had once owned the estate many decades before. But it's not even Jalabi, but El Fulk, which I had the privilege of visiting the inside of today. I'd only ever seen the outside of it. When I came last year, I got to the outside, and that was it. I couldn't go any further, but today I managed to see inside and get a wonderful tour. And it's El Fulk which is more associated to James McBey. He had seen this house, or what was, I suppose, like it, in this specific place back in 1913 when he first visited Tangier. Now in 1949, he made it his own. He renovated El Fulk, just as he had his other properties with typical Scottish gusto as he moved in with McBey in 1949. And you can see a very photogenic Marguerite in this photo, her long hair almost sort of windswept. He writes in his diary, bright moon, writing this at 10:45 p.m. At last, I'm comfortable in Tangier. And then he writes in code, I thank God. James McBey writing in his diary of his new home, El Fulk, on the 30th of December 1949. 4 years later, James McBey turns 70. And he writes again in his diary, it is 2:45 a.m. I am 70 years old today. I try to visualize the night of the 23rd of December 1883 at Newmill, Foveren, of course where he was born. Annie's photo as a girl of 2 or so hangs in my bedroom. For 35 years I have not had anxieties. And then he writes in code, I thank you, God, help me. McBey writing in his diary on the 23rd of December 1953, which was his birthday. And here in a nutshell we have the multi-layered, complex, haunted James McBey in his own words. And as I mentioned earlier, the phrase, wherever you go, there you are. There were so many figures in James McBey's life in Tangier. I had the wonderful opportunity to talk with Sarah and Pin and Jen and other wonderful people over the last few days about the legends of Tangier. I mean, you had Dr. Fraser Anderson, for instance, who was the resident Scottish doctor here in Tangier, and he'd actually been educated at Aberdeen University being in Scotland's northeast being the place where James McBey was from. You had another Lady Scott, who, as I understand it, was the doyenne of Tangier's expat society. And of course, the lady that you see here, but probably you want to look at the original here, Clemence Bonnet Matthews. Now, Clemence, as I said, pictured here by McBey like a movie star almost, would not only make herself available for this portrait, but she would become James McBey's lover, and Marguerite's also. So there's lots of diary references to Clemence in James McBey's diaries in the late 1930s, teaching him the tango. And Clemence would make up a fair share of James McBey's diary code. Now, speaking of his code, I've referenced his code more than once. And here is an example of it as it pertains to Clemence, just for an example. We have the diary entry on the left, complete with the code. And then the code sheet on the right, which I used to crack the code. So the code sheet was actually made up by Marguerite. A, B, C, D were, just all corresponding to the relevant symbols. It was very difficult, despite having that sheet, because just like you would write an S or a D or a B in your own way, McBey would write his code in his own way. And that made life very, very difficult for me. But then I started to understand it, and I started to get what he was saying and the phrases that he would use. So his code was used for his more personal diary entries, since he began actually keeping a diary in 1909, Scotland, during the Edwardian era. And of course here he writes, Clemence came in the afternoon and gave me a dancing lesson. Then he writes in code, she wrote this on top of me, 5:30. McBey diary entry, 8th of March 1938. I'll say no more. But it's intriguing to point out, though, that during the 1920s and the 1930s, whenever you came across code, it was invariably about women and his relationships. And I have to say that when I was starting this, I got very excited when I came to code, because then I knew he was up to no good, and I thought it was quite interesting. But then there's a serious point to this, which is in the 40s and the 50s, the code switches and it becomes about God. I thank you, God. God, I thank you. God, please help me. And why? Well, I can only think of specific reason. He was getting older. He was thinking about his own mortality. But I think we must remember that, you know, all of us are flawed, of course. And James McBey was flawed. The biggest flaw, he was a philanderer. And we shouldn't forget that. And there's no doubting that. When I wrote this biography, I wasn't writing a hagiography. I wasn't writing something, I wasn't protecting him. What I saw is what I wrote. But everybody's flawed. All of us here are flawed. But as far as an artist, he was a sumptuous artist and he was prolific. He never tired or wavered making art, doing so until the end of his life. And he was an artist who adored Morocco and who adored Tangier most of all. On the right here you can see his pen, ink and watercolour called Tangier Port from 1951. And then on the left, in the same medium and the same year, Tangier bringing in the nets. Indeed, he remained into the winter of his life, fascinated and captivated by the traditions of society here, the Moroccan people and the ocean. And don't forget, he was born by the ocean, and he would die by the ocean in Tangier. And of course, he would be buried overlooking the ocean. So here is James McBey today on Sherifian Rocks. And I took this picture last year, and only when I returned to my taxi and looked at my phone did I see that I'd captured a kind of very heavenly scene. I actually was walking away, and you can't see it, but I'd actually left my bag behind the grave, and I had to actually come all the way back down. But when I came and I turned around and I took a quick snap and I caught that scene. And I think the quote here, written by James McBey in 1948 to his wife Marguerite, specifying where he'd like to be buried. If anything should happen and it would be possible without much trouble, I should like to stay in the lower property on the high bit just beneath the Sherifian garden. It is still to me a heaven down there. James McBey writing to Marguerite, September 1948. I think the words, and dare I say it, the picture are very apt. And of course we have the Arabic words on his gravestone. He loved Morocco. Let's give the last word to James McBey himself.
All right. Mrs. McBey told me that you were afraid of the microphone. But I think when you go on like this, you will get over it all.
Well, I don't think I would ever get accustomed to it. When I hear my own voice, I feel just as though you were looking at photographs of myself taken naked.
Well, I think we can finish this for tonight, and thank you very much for this evening.
You're very welcome, all of you.
Thank you so much for listening to me. I can't tell you what a privilege and how honoured I am to be here in Tangier, not just in Tangier, to be in this museum, and not just in this museum, but to be standing in front of McBey's works here. Let me just finish a very light note that I like to just finish on, a poem. This was written by a woman called E. Arnott Robertson in the 1920s. E. Arnott Robertson was a friend of McBey's, but she was also a lover of McBey's. It won't surprise you to learn. She was also actually quite a prolific novelist too in the 1920s. She wrote this about him, and this will give you an idea of James McBey. The wonder grows from day to day how God can look after James McBey. When, as the Bible says, he otter, he casts his bread upon the water. Lo, it returns upon the tide, well buttered on the upper side. When servants leave him, is he stranded? No, God is much too open-handed. He takes 2 angels from the host and sends them via the morning post. No wonder France is still in debt, and bulk the Balkans fume and fret, and trade is in a dreadful plight. God has no time to put things right. He's far too busy night and day in doing things for James McBey. Thank you so much for listening to me. I've loved every minute of this. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Are you willing to take some questions?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
For the audience, please use the internet audience. Please use the mic.
Thank you very much.
That's a pleasure.
I have a letter written by James McBey
Okay.
by Concessa, who was born here, to her explain why Clemencia did not come home one evening.
Ah, right.
And it's got sealing wax and it's signed, and it was given to me by Clemencia's daughter.
I
And
see.
she would love to give it to somebody.
Well, yeah, I mean, I mean, this is the wonderful thing.
I actually met James McBey.
Yeah.
It doesn't, but I was just a very small child.
Well,
I knew
wonderful.
them very well. But I knew specifically Clemencia's daughter.
Right, yes.
Gabrielle.
Who I understand just died a few years ago?
Yes.
2-3 years ago or something.
Yeah.
Yes. She's actually mentioned in James McBey's diary, because she was just a wee girl, I think.
If you can do the grandmother, the mother-in-law of Concessa, Gabrielle Bonnet, I have a little quote. She died in 1935 at 90. Anne Gabrielle was 5. Clemencia had her daughter at 18.
Right,
with
yeah.
a Polish man. So in those years that you're describing, Clemencia was very young.
Yes, very young. Yeah, because I mean, James McBey was considerably older.
Yeah.
Than her. Yes, absolutely.
But
I think a quarter of a century older, actually, maybe 25 years older. Yeah, but there are letters where they write to each other during the war, and she writes to James, and she's like, "Are you getting my letters? Because you're not writing back to me." I mean, this is wonderful what you're saying, because when I've done talks in Aberdeen or in the northeast of Scotland, for instance, I get wonderful people such as yourself that say to me, "I have this letter, I have this sketch, I have this from my grandfather, or my grandfather gave it to me, or I have this wonderful," and this is one of the things I'm discovering, is a lot of people have all kinds of memorabilia and all kinds of history to do with McBey, just like you know.
They owned another house at one point, because my mother and my aunt, who grew up here, were members who were being taken away and spending the night with them.
The McBeys.
Because my grandparents were away and it was sort of a lark, but everybody was all right.
Yeah, are you talking about the McBeys owned yeah, so they, as far as I'm aware, they owned Jalabi, El Fulk, and then they owned the property in Marrakesh, where they used to go to in the winter, because apparently the winter here, and you'll know this better than me, is not so good, and they would go to Marrakesh, and that's why they took that property. And I think you're quite right. I think actually she went to Marrakesh. I think she certainly went to Marrakesh, actually. James and Clemence and Marguerite, they went together in the late 30s.
I think they had to get permission from Concessa because they just lived in the Villa Milagro. It's just above the house.
Yeah.
Anyhow,
Thank you so much.
I have the letter.
I'd love to see it, very much. Oh, I'm going tomorrow, actually, at 3:30. Hi. Oh, where am I? Just up there.
Let's do this offline. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi,
Hi there, hi.
Thanks so much for this talk. And
It's a pleasure,
congratulations
it's
on
a
your
pleasure.
book. It's great to be able to learn more about James McBey. I have 2 questions. One is about historical context, and the other is more about the art.
Sure.
I noticed that his first trip to Morocco happened in 1912 and 1913, which is right at the very beginning, the cusp of the Protectorate period.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if either in the diary entries or in the artistic production you saw, I'm just curious to know how he reflected on what was a really significant moment in Moroccan history.
Yeah.
So that's about the historical context. And then the second question, which is about the art, I noticed that just before coming to Morocco in 1911, he'd been in Spain. And there's, of course, a really long tradition of European artists from David Roberts, Delacroix, and others who go to Morocco through Spain.
Yeah.
And very often the ways that they represent Morocco is shaped by how they saw Spain and vice versa. So I'm just wondering if you saw any relationship between how he represented Spain and how he represented Morocco visually, at least in those early works.
Well, I think your second question, when he returns to Morocco after 20 years, he's quite disappointed when he goes back to Tetuan, because he discovers, because I think Tetuan was was the base or the capital of the Spanish protectorate, and he discovers that it's been Europeanized, and he's quite upset about that. There's bandstands and things that he thinks shouldn't be there. And he does reference that actually in his diary. He does make reference to that. I think in terms of the first part of your question, he knew very well, I think, that Morocco, I mean, let's face it, Morocco at that time was not like going to Benidorm for your holidays. You know, it was a dangerous place. There was all kinds of things happening. And when he actually had to go from Tetuan to Tangier, he details how dangerous it was, and how actually the consul general in Tetuan told him not to travel. And an artist actually in Tetuan tells him not to travel, but he travels anyway. And he gets actually transported, because it's not so far, Tetuan and Tangier, as I understand it, but he gets transported by donkey across the way. And he arrives, he talks about arriving in Tangier full of mud, and he's in pain because he's been on this donkey for quite a while. So I think he knew very well. He actually says to a friend, I'm going to Tangier, if you don't hear from me in the next 2 weeks, I would invest in my etchings. This is known as insider information, because he thought something might happen to him. So yeah, he was fully aware of what was happening in that sense. And I think he was a young man. I think he kind of loved it. And I think when he came home, as I said, I think in my talk, he waxed lyrical about how dangerous it was, and how kind of shady it was, and how he'd survived it, you know, in a sense. And of course, maybe there was a bit of colour there, but I think, to be honest, Morocco was quite it was a volatile land during that period. I hope that answers your question in some sense.
Yeah, thank you.
That's a pleasure.
Hi.
Hi.
Do you know if he was in touch with other artists in Tangier? I mean, was there a community of artists? Did he meet people travelling here?
Do you know, that's a really great question, because as far as I'm aware, he was a very independent man. He did things his own way. And he wasn't really a guy that seemed to socialise very much with the establishment or the art fraternity. There are mentions in his diary, but it's quite sparse. I think it's safe to say that he was his own man in every respect, and that he did things his own way, and that he did what he wanted to do. And both back in Britain, when he was being asked to join societies, and he was, I don't want to join any societies. That's not what I do. I don't join things. I'm independent. And I think it was the same in Morocco too. There's nothing that I discovered that he was massively involved with any movement here in Morocco. No, if you were going to, yeah.
No, he obviously was a member of the Chelsea Arts Club.
He was a member of the Chelsea Arts Club, and that was pretty much about it. I think I said, actually, I was talking earlier on about how, for example, he discovers his name is on the list to be nominated for the Royal Academy in London. The Royal Academy, of course, as you know, is the highest accolade. Every artist wants to be an RA and a member of the Academy. And he discovers, and I've seen the list and the votes, and his name keeps going forward. His name goes forward and then into the 30s. But he's got no idea that his name's on this list, because it's that kind of process. Then he discovers, one of his friends tells him, because he is in touch with artists and other people, but not to like a significant extent where he was, wanting to become a member of a society. But he discovers his name is on this list, and he writes a letter saying, "Take me off the list. I don't want to be a member of the RA." But he says it very humbly. He's very self-effacing. He's very polite. But he's basically like, I didn't know my name was on this list to be a member of the RA, and please take me off it. And the secretary writes back to him and says, okay, I'll take you off it. Because he was kind of like, I don't need to be a member of an establishment or an institution. I've done things my own way all this time. I'll just continue doing things my own way. And that was very much his mindset.
Do you think he was financed by Marguerite?
He was financed by Marguerite.
What I mean, if he wasn't part of an establishment as an artist, he lived quite a long time and he lived quite well.
Yeah.
So the money must have come from somewhere.
Well, the money, I mean, in the 20s, he did very well from his etchings. Probably not as well as he could have done, because he had an agent and an agency. But as I said, his etchings were selling like hotcakes, during that time. And then in the 30s, he turned his attentions to portraits. Of course, Marguerite did come from, Marguerite's father was a wealthy tobacco, merchant. There's nothing that I've seen actually that suggests that Marguerite was financing James. And in actual fact, James made all the decisions. And as the typical bank clerk, in his diaries, you can see him adding up his earnings and what he has in his account with finite detail. Because by the time the 1940s come, he's making art that he hates because he's stuck in America. But he's making art of like judges and chief executives and so on and so forth, because he's stuck in America during World War II and he can't do the art that he wants to do. But he's making phenomenal sums of money. But I think actually, in a way, his diaries are phenomenal and fantastic for actually, he's very much about tax and about, he was always the bank clerk, he was always the Scottish, he always had that Scottish, Presbyterianism in him, where he counted his pennies. But he had money, obviously, and I think, he had money from his art, and he came here and this is what, and he made all the decisions, incidentally. Marguerite would go along with everything he said. He wanted to buy Jalabé, she said okay. He wanted that property in Marrakesh, she said okay. And it wasn't until he died, that she obviously had a life of her own.
Ali, I just wanted to note, I'm monitoring our live stream.
Yeah.
And there's a little message that says, Katie Loeb Schwab is watching from North Carolina.
Oh, wonderful.
As is my sister Barbara Keller in Nova Scotia. Wonderful to hear and see.
Oh,
I would imagine there's a family connection there.
Yeah, those are Marguerite's nieces. Joan and Katie and Barbara are the nieces of Marguerite. And they visited Tangier in 1956, I believe, and maybe they'll tell me if I'm wrong on Facebook, that Katie was about 5, Joan was about 8, and Barbara was 12. And Barbara being 12, she can remember a relative amount of it. And I think Joan can remember a wee bit too. I don't think Katie can, but they were here in 1956. And in actual fact, this is the photograph, and I've actually cut him out, if I can find it. Here it is. On the right there, he's actually got his arm around Joan. Because Joan and McBey, they got along particularly well together. I understand that James McBey made them earrings too, because he was good with his hands. He could make anything. But this was 1956, so just 3 years before he died.
So the auction last year, which was I think in North Carolina, or around at Birmingham, I think.
End of 21, wasn't it?
So I presume one of her nieces died, and all the things came from her. Would that be right?
One of the nieces? No. I would say that the rumours of their death are greatly exaggerated, because all 3 of them are alive. Yeah, it was because they were downsizing. So I think Joan was downsizing specifically, and auctioned off. I think is it Brunk? Brunk, the auction house Brunk. Yes, that's right. But it was purely due to downsizing. Yes.
Including the wonderful sketchbook.
Including
the building.
Yes.
Of,
yes.
Which I don't know where it went.
Yes, absolutely. It was to do with downsizing. Yes, that's as I understand it. Yeah. We have another.
Thanks, Ali, for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Question comes up now. Gazebo.
Yes.
What's the story behind it? Because
yeah, do you know something? I could flannel a bit with you, but I'm not going to. That is something that I'm still a little bit. I went on a tour today of Elfulk. Now I understand from my understanding, trying to piece together his diaries, the gazebo was something that they made, and that's where Hortense stayed. That's what I understand. But I'm not going to bet my life on this.
Excuse me, it belonged to her mother. It was Marguerite's mother.
Hortense, yeah, Hortense, yeah. Marguerite's mother, Hortense, because Marguerite's mother, Hortense, she lived in she spent a lot of her time in Tangier, and then tragically she was returning home to America, where she died on board ship as she was leaving. But yes, Hortense was the mother. Yes, of course. That's what I understand. I mean, I'm not going to pontificate about something which I'm a little bit unsure of myself. Obviously, my kind of focus was on Elfulk itself, because that was James McBey's house and Marguerite's house.
But we don't know.
Oh well, you're the man.
Because I didn't see, but
yes, of course.
It could well have been part of their property.
Yeah.
Because it's a hectare of land.
Yeah.
Directly in front, and I believe gazebo was a very small little building.
Mm-hmm.
That Hortense Lowe, whether she was gifted the land or whether she bought it independently, made into a small house that she called gazebo.
Yeah, and it said gazebo on it. I seen like a picture.
It used to have on the outside of
gazebo,
the house that I bought. It said gazebo on it.
Yeah. Okay.
So, but it may well have been their land.
Yes.
Because it's directly in front. It
could well
have been.
I mean, McBey makes reference to the gazebo, and he talks about how Marguerite and another lady friend of James McBey's called Molly Murray, who comes over to Tangier, they're putting up curtains in the gazebo. And Hortense spent a lot of time in Tangier. And then, of course, as I said, she went back, I think it was in the 50s, and she died in her sleep.
Ali, I want to thank you very much. I think at this
pleasure.
point we will break the formal part of the presentation, but I know that you're willing to stay and sign books and answer any questions that people may have informally. Thank you again for joining us, Ali. Thank you for those of you who are watching on the internet, and thanks for all of you who are here.
Thank you.